Hello and welcome to this edition of Consciousness Raising Online. Good to see you, Clyde. Is everything kosher? Um, Here's what I'm going to do because today, this is a thank you. This is a might seem strange at first. Uh, and it wasn't, by the way, the topic is purposely obscured. I did that because I didn't want to tip off what was going on. But the title of the topic is Where Did Suburbs Come From? Suburbs. And so what I want to do is look back at some things so we can understand why we got to where we are today. Now, the first thing I want to say is that if you are under 50 years old watching and listening to this, then it's very likely that what you're going to experience over the next few minutes is you're going to get some information that may help you understand what influenced your parents' generation a great deal, a great deal. If you are over 50, you are probably going to experience a little uh, deja vu, or at least recognize a lot of what we're going to see over the next few minutes as what may have influenced you or your friends or your relatives, family, etc. Because what it deals with is what is commonly called the American dream. Okay. Uh, Now, first, in order to set this up, I'm going to show a short video that brings us from basically from the end of the war, World War II, to a point where for a lot of people, and when I say a lot, you're going to be surprised, I think, at the numbers of people who were able to move into the American dream in a way that had not been possible for generations before. Okay? So here is a walk through the past.
And in many ways they were. As a nation, they had been through some very rough times. 10 years of the Great Depression, and 6 years of World War II, where tens of millions had died. And much of Europe and Asia were destroyed. Now, post-war Americans felt that it was finally their time to settle down, to live what was called the good life. For most Americans, The good life meant working toward living the American dream.
Maybe a nice home in suburbia and some nice kids and a beer and a ball game on a Saturday afternoon.
And we'll have the living room right in here. And kitchen right here. And, oh, darling, it's going to be just perfect.
The American dream. Owning a home.
Because a well-built house with adequate leisure can live and work as better Americans.
And a car, or maybe two.
An American car. We have a right to take pride in our cars.
And modern appliances that their grandparents had never known.
You can own your own home, complete with its own refrigerator, television set, and clothes dryer.
Boy, here's real emancipation from old-fashioned chores.
A refrigerator, washer and dryer, perhaps a dishwasher, and so much more. And all of this was possible because of our industrial and economic power, and because of what was commonly called better living through science.
Inventors, engineers, and manufacturers continually offer us improvements so we can have
Ever greater progress in science and business that ensure a way of life that is physically gratifying and spiritually uplifting.
Chemists have a lot to do with this, turning coal into everything from truck tires to sheer 90s.
The world of science has given us some fabulous things.
Materials which make fabrics more beautiful and easier to care for than natural ones.
New and better stretch yarn for women's stockings.
In the world of tomorrow, plastics will certainly call the tune.
The scientist has something to offer to the public which is far, far more than gadgets and inventions.
We had faith in our science and our scientists. In the 1950s, American scientists had given us the discovery of DNA.
The thread of life.
And the Salk polio vaccine.
A vaccine to prevent paralytic polio, developed by Dr. Jonas Salk.
And American engineers won high praise worldwide for our new American highway system, with millions of miles of paved roads.
More motorized mobility than ever dreamed of before.
Freedom of movement for all, symbol of democracy.
We have become the nation on wheels.
And this is Levittown.
Levittown, one of the world's largest single-unit housing developments.
To make the American dream a reality for everyone, developers were building tens of millions of houses.
The budget-priced home. This symbol of modern American living has changed the great USA.
You can raise your children far from the city's dirt, crowding and crime, in comfort and safety.
Suburban cities sprang up almost overnight, with new water supply systems, street lights, sewer systems, electrical power grids, and more. Much of the infrastructure we depend on today was built during this time. As millions of people bought homes and got college degrees and, quote, settled down, they became a part of something that the world had never seen: the huge American middle class.
Never in history has the American family known such well-being.
A standard of living beyond the wildest dreams of anyone who lived a half-century ago.
Today, the middle-class American dream is sometimes made fun of. But for adults at that time, it wasn't funny. It was literally a dream come true.
Wow. Now, like I said, some of the things that that we're talking about, that we're looking at right now, that you just saw, if you're under 50, you probably are not that familiar with how the society was. And if you're over 50, then I'm pretty sure you recall those things very well. So you have to understand, for an example, it talked about better living through science. See, after the World War II, the United States was positioned to become the number one world power, and there was a great deal of perceived prosperity. Scientists were, the corporations were doing all kinds of stuff. One of the things that was real deep was the advent of plastic into the society. See, we take it for granted today, but prior to the war and prior to the introduction of plastic as one of the primary things that things were made of, they were made out of wood, they were made out of steel, they were made out of concrete, they were made out of glass, and then plastics became the new thing. And soon, everything was being made with plastic, which on the one hand made certain things less expensive or cheaper, but it actually came at a great cost. It really did. We didn't know, because in order to make plastic, which is a product, a petroleum product, by the way, meaning oil, it has a tremendous what's the word I'm looking for, Clyde? The after what it takes to make plastic, the discards or the throwaway part is more than the plastic that you get. So the society was moving fast, okay? But here's the other part. As this graph is showing us, the American dream, suburbs, meaning urban, the sub part of the urban atmosphere. Okay, affordable single family housing. People wanted good schools. They wanted friendly neighbors like themselves. That's very, very particular there. New highways. This country went on a highway building binge that was incredible, as it showed in that video. They built millions of miles of roads, highways, byways, expressways, automobiles, yeah, affordable automobiles. They went to selling them like crazy. And gasoline prices were very, very low. And let me go back to automobiles for a second. The big three automobile companies, what was it? Chevrolet, Ford, and what was the other one? Oldsmobile, I guess. Whatever the big three were, they were run by former generals in the military in World War II. And so they came on like gangbusters. Okay, and you see that little statistic there, 13 million homes built in the 1950s, 85% were suburban. That's going to have more meaning in just a moment. All right, let's check this out.
In 1945, Americans needed 5 million new low-cost homes, and they needed them right away.
Now there are building materials.
The elusive dream of home ownership would soon be realized by a man about to fulfill a dream of his own and invent a new phenomenon, suburbia.
Bill Levitt, as a young man working with the Seabees in World War II, has this brilliant idea, taking some of the techniques he's seeing right then and there in World War II, building airstrips, putting up housing for GIs, and bringing them back to America for ordinary people. He's sitting there at night with his pals in the Pacific in World War II and saying, what do you want when you get home? Well, I want a house and a car.
Bill Levitt's special genius was figuring out how to mass produce the American dream.
We first came to see that property where they were going to build. It was potato farms, and it stretched like from here to eternity. You would see concrete foundations, nothing but concrete with the heat in. And then down the road there, where in the midst of all the dust, was a frame job going on. And then down on the dust was where he completed, was the sheathing going. And then down the road a bit, And it was like putting your clothes on, from your socks on first, you know, and then putting your underwear on and the shirt, and finally way down on the other end.
It was a finished product.
It was a finished house. And yet you could see how it grew.
Before the war, the average contractor built 5 houses a year. In Levittown, Long Island, they built 36 houses a day, a grand total of 17,450.
Yeah, that was funny watching them build that house. It made me think about. I'm not gonna say it, but anyway, let's understand what's happening here. Okay, so after the war, you had all these soldiers, right, coming home, and they wanted homes. The country was way behind in terms of having housing, and so Levittown, which this guy Levitt built, the first one, and became a model. Let's talk about what a suburb is. A suburb is a mixed use or residential area existing pretty much as a separate residential community within commuting distance of a city. Okay? The suburban population in North America exploded during the post World War II economic expansion because the veterans wanted housing. Okay? And so Levittown became like the prototype for mass-produced housing. That's what I want you to get an understanding of. Mass-produced housing, as you saw in that clip where they went to building that house. Where they say they were building 36 houses a day. Was that what they said? 36 a day. Talking about houses. Okay. Now, the GI Bill guaranteed low-cost loans for veterans with very low down payments and low interest rates. And this is key here. With 16 million eligible veterans, 16 million eligible veterans, the opportunity to buy a house was suddenly, bam, right there. In 1947 alone, 540,000 veterans bought a house. The average price was $7,300. As we got into the 50s with Levittown doing it, it exploded. It exploded. But now listen to what was going on. They were able to, because they standardized certain things. So standardized sizes for kitchen cabinets, for refrigerators and stoves. And it allowed for mass production of kitchen furnishings, right? So the developers started purchasing empty land just outside of the city, and installed tract houses with very few differences in design. As you see this Levittown in 1957, right? Those 4 basic houses was the houses. Okay? And of course, they put up these tracts or subdivisions, as they came to be called, provided streets and utilities. Local public officials, they raced to build schools. They had to build tons of schools because they had this baby boom. That's where this baby boom generation thing comes from 1946 through 1965. That was the baby boom generation. I was born in it. Some of you all may have been. Tract, like TRACT, tract homes. Okay. Now the first one was the first Levittown was um, in Long Island, and back then a new house was $1,000 down and $70 a month. It had 3 bedrooms, a fireplace, a gas range, and a gas furnace, and a landscape lot 70 by 100 feet, all for a total price of $10,000. And veterans could get it for a lot less down. They didn't have to put down $1,000. Y'all understand how huge that is? Um, Let me take you another step further.
We've got to move.
And so they join the stream of family life in the suburbs, soon to become part of its familiar sights, soon to absorb its familiar sounds.
Anybody home?
Okay, it takes you another step, right? Because you had these folks that were desperately looking for housing, and then all of a sudden, all these homes were being built. Now, what was going on with Levitt and Sons, of course, but then you had others jump in the deal. But Levitt started out with they built 4 planned communities, all of them called Levitt Towns, in New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Puerto Rico. The one in New York was first. Then they also influenced uh, some of the designs in places like Buffalo Grove, Illinois, which is right in the suburb of Chicago, Vernon Hills, Illinois, another suburb of Chicago, Willingboro Township, New Jersey, the Bel Air section of Bowie, Maryland, and the Greenbrier section of Fairfax, Virginia. So they were influencing the building of places all over the country. And that's how come you had an explosion of suburbs. Um, Now, also, let me see, you had, some other areas where they started seeing more suburbs, right? Um, Boston, Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, Dallas, Denver, Houston, New York City, San Francisco, Sacramento, Atlanta, Miami, Milwaukee, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Phoenix, Roanoke, Virginia, St. Louis, Salt Lake City, Las Vegas, Minneapolis, Washington, D.C. And they all followed the same pattern. They followed the same pattern. Okay. And I don't know, maybe some of you all might have grown up with in a suburb. I don't know. Actually, my family moved out into a suburb. It wasn't until 1970. Okay. And we didn't see it like we didn't have an understanding of like I know now, how they were set up. But it was actually a planned community where my mother moved first. In fact, some of y'all may understand this. In Chicagoland, there's a suburb called Park Forest. It's a south suburb. Well, it had a suburb at one time called Park Forest South. And Park Forest was a planned community. The guy who basically developed Park Forest, he set it up so that there would be X amount of white people, X amount of black people, X amount of professional people, X amount of factory workers. The whole thing was like very much laid out. And it stayed that way for a long time. Now, Park Forest South was the outgrowth of that. And then some years later, they split from Park Forest and they changed their name to University Park, which it still is to this day. But Chicago is not new to the idea of planned communities. There's a place it's actually in Chicago within the city limits. It's called Pullman, the Pullman community. And it was a planned community as well by Pullman, the guy who created the Pullman train cars, the luxury train cars, and of course, where we get the Pullman porters from. They were actually called the sleeping car porters. Okay, it was actually the first major black union recognized in this country. But we know them also as the Pullman porters because Pullman built a whole town called Pullman. Now the deep thing was because he built the Pullman train cars, the sleeping cars were built in this community. He had the factory there and the workers who built the cars and all of that. It had everything. It had the stores, the churches, the houses, everything. Of course, he didn't let black people stay there. The Pullman porters couldn't live in Pullman, all right? But my point here is this. You had this explosion of homes, and it made it possible for people to have their first homes. And they got them dirt cheap, dirt cheap. Check this out.
In the first year of peace, more than 2 million couples were married. By 1950, 21 million babies had been born in a seemingly endless baby boom.
I came out of service out of the Navy in '46, and I wanted to go and marry the girl that was writing the 3 letters a week to me for 4 years. And she lived in Floral Park. I had a tavern there. And I moved in with the family. There was a mother and father, her sister and brother, and myself, and a baby coming on after a year.
Despite weeks and months of house hunting, some 3 million married couples throughout the country today are still unable to establish homes of their own.
When you look at the books that you read in school, you read of people in a house. You never read of people living in an apartment, which we did, in trees. It sounds, and it's all new. You know, it was really something that you would like to have.
Now, one of the things is that as we look at this, I think you're beginning to get a picture now, right? Of how this whole lifestyle began to form because we had not had suburban life before. You had rural areas. Okay, now let's be different. Let's differentiate. See, rural areas like farms and all that stuff. You had those outside the cities. In fact, a lot of times people came from the farm to the city, to the big city, right? But that's what you had. You had rural, small towns and rural areas, and then you had the cities. Now you had running around the country these tracts, these subdivisions blowing up, these suburbia, and with suburbia came a new lifestyle. Okay, they were able to get these homes with a television in the living room and modern appliances and a cars and stuff, right? So they were living the life of Riley. Now keep up with me because I'm not through. You got to check this out.
On their own for the first time, and determined not to miss a single new homemaking idea. They're busy just making choices and welcome solid information in concise form. It takes a while for a young couple to realize all they're in for when they buy a house or when they have a baby. And when they buy a house and have a baby, so hardly realizing it, they come into their purchasing stage and are off on a wild, non-stop ride. It's a happy-go-spending whirl, reflected in the windows of the suburban shopping centers where they go to buy. Red Book has been studying shopping centers because the people who created the suburbs are young adults, and the shopping centers are built in their image. Selling to young adults demands a new kind of marketing. For these young adults, the shopping centers have built fountains, commissioned statues, put in restaurants and freestanding stairways. They've included banks, loan offices, rental plans, plant nurseries, and places to buy building materials. The shopping centers see these young adults as people whose homes are always in need of expansion. People who buy in large quantities and truck it away in their cars. It's a big market. To help people find their cars, the centers have enlisted the children. They've put in shopmobiles to help them cover the ground. They've added banks of storage lockers, miles of checkout counters, and endless rows of carts. Carts rolling down the malls at Southdale, at Northland, at Gulfgate, Sunrise, and East Point, at Hillsdale in California. These young adults, shopping with the same determination that led them to the suburbs in the first place, are the goingest part of a nation on wheels. Living by the automobile, the first young adults in the age of the push button. Like the rest of life in suburbia, shopping has a family flavor.
Do you remember what size she was? 5.
Then we bought a tree to go with it.
Yes, that was pretty nice.
I don't know. Shall I take it?
These busy families make the shopping centers look young and colorful.
Ooh, buddy. Wasn't they some buying people? Wasn't they some consumers, weren't they? Y'all see what I'm talking about? See, that didn't happen. That had not always been that way. This was something that began after World War II, and as it got into the 50s, these people went plumb crazy. They were buying everything and they were living the high life. Look at this, the suburban lifestyle, right? And you saw them with the shopping mall. The mall didn't come into existence till the suburbs were created. That's where the malls come from, right? And so it was like, whoa, buddy. And like I say, they were living it up, buying everything. And now you're gonna notice something a little different in a minute. Here's a great example. Now that's one of the Levitt towns. Look at that. How do you even find your house? When you look at it from this view, it's like, dang. Because all of them looked so much alike. And yeah, they had addresses and stuff, but whoa. But there's a mentality that goes into that as well. Okay? And the suburban lifestyle became major in the 50s and then into the 60s. And the cities were going through changes, the urban areas. See, there was a time urban didn't mean like it does now. It's a code word for black people, right? But back then, you didn't even see the word urban. You saw suburb and suburbia, and those were considered the joys of life. Now, all right, here's where it gets deeper.
Designed for a family of 4, Levitt's basic Cape Cod sold for a minimum down payment at a price most people could afford.
I think there's a great ad in there. Mr. Veteran, you're a lucky guy. You know, you can buy this house with $100 down. The first day that they were going to sell them, the lines were, people started lining up 72 hours before the houses went on sale. Even Levitt was stunned.
A second Levittown in Pennsylvania was every bit as successful as the Long Island Levittown. Everyone, it seemed, wanted a Bill Levitt home.
I beg your pardon, sir. Would you mind telling me who you are and where you're from?
I'm David Poole from Atlantic City, New Jersey.
And would you tell me why you're moving here to Levittown?
Well, I'm working in this area now, and I've looked the houses over, and I think it's a fine place to raise a family, so I've decided to buy one.
Very good, sir.
My house was a little Cape Cod cottage with a trellis over the door and one window on either side, and it was 4 rooms, nice kitchen, an eat-in kitchen, decent-sized living room, 2 small bedrooms, and a bathroom, and it had doors that I could close and open and close and open with. We had always lived in furnished rooms. We had no privacy whatsoever, nothing. It was perfect for a young couple.
And we had a Bendix in the kitchen.
That's right, Bendix washing machine in the kitchen. First time I ever saw a washing machine, I think.
And we fell in love because that washing machine was underneath the stairs, you know. And before that, when we had the baby, you know, it was like 16, 17 diapers a day to wash, boil them on the stove. And needless to say, the family wanted to get rid of us, too. They didn't need a baby that was crying in that, you know, tight quarters. You know, and to have a house of your own. Man, that was the way we felt, you know.
After the Depression, all this come on, so it was kind of a gift from heaven, you know. You found these wonderful houses to move in.
And the best thing about it, I guess, was our independence. It was the first time we were away from our parents, completely independent, and we did what we wanted when we wanted. Like any kids, they wanted to be on their own, and we were.
And we could start our family.
That's right. And the rapport between neighbors was, at first, was very good. Excellent, in fact.
Because they were all in the same boat as us. They were all first starting out, mostly young like us, and just starting with their family and their first house, too.
The new middle-class families of Levittown had one other thing in common. They were all white.
I walked up to the salesperson and I said to him, "We're very interested in your house and we'd like an application." And I remember what he said to me. He looked at me, he said, "It's not me, but the management has not as yet decided whether he's going to sell these houses to Negroes or not."
Mm-hmm. You can't believe it. You really thought you had it made. You know, everything is falling into place.
Well, I'd like you to conceive that somebody telling you that, and there's no recourse, telling you that openly and outright like that.
Bill Levitt saw himself as a home builder, not as a social engineer, and he refused to sell to blacks. There were court cases against him, and the fact is he was all too typical of what existed in real estate in America in those days, in believing that you did not have to and should not have to sell to people who were not white.
Yeah. Part of the story I didn't tell you about is this. When these homes were being built, part of the deal was that they were racially discriminatory in that you could not sell or rent these homes to anybody except white people. They had to be Caucasians. And that included the military veterans. Even if you were a veteran, if you were black, you could not get a home. The FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, they mandated that these areas, these suburbs, be white only. See, at the time, people thought it was just a personal preference. No, that's not true. Redlining for many years was thought to be something that the banks just did. That's not true either. The federal government created redlining. They're the ones who did the redlining, meaning that they would they would set out on a map what areas, like if it was green, that meant it was cool. You could give mortgages in that area. That meant it was white. If it was yellow, that meant, well, it had a few foreigners and a few non-whites that might have meant Mexicans or whatever. But it was still marginal. But if it was red, if it had a red line around it, no mortgages, because that meant it was predominantly black. And if it was not predominantly black at that time, it was expected to go black. And so they stopped giving mortgages. Tell you a story about family. You heard that black couple there talking about it, but here's Bill and Daisy Myers. It's them here. They were a young black couple with 3 small children when they moved into Levittown in Pennsylvania. They were both college graduates and they were looking just for a peaceful place to raise their children. And how they got in is not known. Somebody blew it. On August 13th, 1957, the mailman there, the Levittown mailman, finding out that they were black, he actually walked around the neighborhood shouting, "It's happened. Niggers have moved into Levittown." And at first, what happened, groups of housewives, white women, gathered across the street from their house, and they were spitting and cursing and all of that at the house, at the people. Before nightfall, over 300 townspeople had formed in front of the house to throw rocks and smash the windows of the home. It didn't stop there. They came there every night. You see that? You see those crowds? They came every night. And they had 8 crosses burned on their lawn and one on the lawn of their neighbor who was trying to defend them. And to try to get the Myers out of their home and out of town, something called the Levittown Betterment Committee was formed. And they were trying to do a peaceful move out, but if that didn't work, they were prepared to do worse. A Ku Klux Klan clavern organized in the town. The police chief was telling the townspeople that Myers was a communist. One time they discovered in the bushes near the bedroom of the youngest child, he was only 2 months old at the time, they found bottles filled with gasoline, Molotov cocktails. They found Molotov cocktails outside the window. They just had not been, I guess they didn't do them right. The family was forced to leave their house 3 times in the first 2 weeks. So finally, the governor at the time sent the state police in there to restore order and gave the Myers protection. They finally moved. They just said they were through with it. That was in 1961 when they moved. They got a public apology from the township in 1999. Did you hear what I said? They moved in 1961, but they didn't get an apology, a public apology, till 1999. How long is that? 71, 81, 91. Then in 40 years before they got a public apology. So that was the other part of what was going on. Yeah, what'd you say, the mailman? Yeah, the mailman. He was the town crier. But see, I wanted to set up so you can see how idyllic life was for the white people, right? And what was going on with black people? What was going on with black people in the 1950s? Well, let's start out in the 1950s. That was when Ralph Bunche won the Nobel Peace Prize, mediating the Arab-Israeli conflict. Gwendolyn Brooks got the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry. She was the first black person to get that. Chuck Cooper, Nathaniel Clifton, and Earl Lloyd. They were the first black players in the National Basketball Association. 1951, an estimated 3,500 whites tried to keep a black family from moving into an apartment building in Cicero. The governor, Adlai Stevenson at the time, had to call the National Guard in to protect the family. That's a real deep story. Cicero, for those that don't know, it's a suburb of Chicago, and it's notoriously known for being gangster, owned by gangsters. That's where Al Capone and his people, they loved Cicero, and it's been known for years. But it also was known as a place where if you was black, don't be caught there after dark. When I was a kid, we learned that early. If you had to go into Cicero, maybe to work at a job or something, you got the heck out of there. And even the bus, which might run right next to Cicero, you didn't even want to get off at the bus and be waiting for a bus to go home if it was too close to Cicero, because they would ride by and jump out and beat you with baseball bats and chains. There were people got killed that way. 1951, in Florida, NAACP official Harry Moore was killed by a bomb. Okay. Also in 1951, Johnson Publishing Company printed the first issue of Jet magazine. 1954, Supreme Court declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional in Brown versus the Board of Education. 1955, Money, Mississippi, 14-year-old Emmett Till was killed. Rosa Parks was arrested after refusing to give up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama. 1956, Nat King Cole had the first primetime show on national TV. And that was really, it was a deep show because the show was great, but you know what happened, right? In the South, they wouldn't show the show. And the white folks said, we're going to boycott the sponsors. And so they couldn't get any national sponsors for the show. And so it died because of that. But it's interesting, in the same year, Harry Belafonte did an album called Calypso, and was the first record to sell more than 1 million copies. Of course, his face was not on the album. 1957, Congress establishes the Civil Rights Act of 1957. See, y'all only know about the one in 60 something, but there was one in 1957. And this was the first legislative act protecting the rights of black people since Reconstruction. It established the Civil Rights section of the Justice Department. Dig this is deep. So now federal prosecutors are able to get court injunctions from against those that were trying to keep black people from the right to vote. And under this act, the Federal Civil Rights Commission was established. That was 1957. Now, why is that important to understand? Because that's when they established the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, which just last week, actually when Trump got in there and he got this dude Beauregard Sessions as the Attorney General, one of the first things he did was turn the Civil Rights section of the Justice Department upside down and said it would no longer pursue cases of black people being discriminated against, but instead that they would look into cases where white people were being discriminated against. Okay? And just last week, they did some other stuff dealing with affirmative action and all of this stuff. They're overturning, this is why I say this, that all the time, that what Trump and his minions are doing, they're overturning things that went for 40, 50 years that we had to fight for. 1957, federal troops sent to Little Rock, Arkansas by President Dwight Eisenhower to enforce desegregation of Central High School. The troops had to protect 9 black students and stayed there for the entire academic year. 1958, the SCLC was established in Atlanta, Georgia. Martin Luther King Jr. was established as the first president of the SCLC. Southern Christian Leadership Conference is what it stands for. In New York, the Alvin Ailey Dance Theater was founded, and Althea Gibson, first black woman to win the U.S. Open Championship. She also won Wimbledon, and she was voted Woman Athlete of the Year. 1959, Motown Records was formed by Berry Gordy in Detroit. A Raisin in the Sun, play written by Lorraine Hansberry, who graduated from my high school in Chicago, Inglewood. And it opened on Broadway. The play is the first to be produced by an African-American woman on Broadway. And all the actors from that time, that was like it was like a thing you had to do. You had to be in Raisin. From you name an actor from that time period, they all did Raisin. And then some of them got to be in the movie with Sidney Poitier and Ruby Dee, but that was the play to be in. And it's deep because I never knew until a friend of mine wrote a book about the Policy Kings that we came to find out that how that all worked, because they got that house And the white folks in that area, they had something called restrictive covenants back then. That's what they had in the Levitt towns, where you signed an agreement not to sell or rent to blacks or Jews, even though Levitt was a Jew, but he was more interested in the money. But in all across the country, they had what they call restrictive covenants. And it was Hansberry's family that sued about that with the Policy King's money and lawyers. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled, though, that restrictive covenants were unconstitutional. That broke that all over the country, and it's very little known. That's what Raisin and Son, that's what happened to her family, but she didn't have that in the play. That's not in the play at all. Okay? So it's just good to know. But that's what was going on with black people during the time that white folks were living such a good life in suburbia. Okay. And part of what was going on too was that black folks, as they were getting better jobs and better education, they were moving. And so you had white flight. That's what it was called. White folks were moving out of the neighborhoods in the cities. They were moving out to the suburbs. And the government made it easy for them. Easy as heck. They facilitated them leaving. And businesses took their businesses out of the city as well and out to the burbs. So it was see, people would say, well, you sound like you're making it a conspiracy. It was. It was a conspiracy, a grand conspiracy, a national conspiracy. And black people suffered because of it. Check this out.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is William Levitt, who heads the largest home building firm in the world.
Bill Levitt would become one of the richest men in America by providing architectural, not racial, equality.
Unlike anything we ever encountered before.
This is one of 4 models which are now being built throughout Levittown. The 4 models vary slightly in overall design, but each has the same number of rooms. 2 bedrooms.
I think it was that sense that Americans really did like the comfort of having what the other guy had, but yet they could put a little fence around it and say, this is mine. And that's really a particular American genius, is to say, this is yours, this is mine, but we're still all the same.
Did you get all your trees yet? Or is this the first one?
An army of Levitt imitators carried the housing revolution across the country.
Thank goodness that's
By 1955, 3 out of every 4 houses built were built in Levitt-style subdivisions.
I think Levittown represented to a lot of city dwellers a dream that had eluded them all through the Depression and the war, which was to have a place somewhere with a patch of green in the back where their kids were going to be able to live better than they did. And to that extent, it fulfilled that particular vision. To another whole group of us growing up in cities, Levittown was a surrender. You know, that was exactly what we didn't want to be. To us, going to Levittown would be like going to Attica.
Its critics said that Levittown was little more than a voluntary prison, a multitude of uniform houses lined up at uniform distances on uniform roads in a treeless waste. What the critics said did not matter to the homeowners of Levittown. They had built sturdy new lives in sturdy new houses and wrapped their newborn into the nest.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Wow. Yeah, Clyde, you call it white gentrification, but actually what it was making it possible for white people to be happy at the expense of black people, because it allowed them to have these homes, right? And look at it. Look at this. This was all over America. They got into them homes dirt cheap. Okay? They were already making more money than black people. But then they got to live in homes. And they raised their children in these lily white communities in the suburbs and all of that. But here's what happened. First of all, as we got into the 2000s, especially more and more black people were moving out to the suburbs, but also something else began to happen. The generational change. See, the children of the suburbanites, the first generation suburbanites, they hated suburbia. They wanted to be in the city. And so they started returning to the city. Now it's even deeper because that's where we get gentrification from. Okay? Um, and the projects, you're right, they started building projects for the black people. Now they've been tearing down the projects the last 10, 15 years to make room for the white young people to come back into the city. That's the gentrification. You see, because they don't want to live in the suburbs. Now it's like, yeah, that drive in every day to the job, they hated that. The good entertainment and food, they want all of that. That's in the city. And so now they're coming back. Uh, and you see it. If you look at the major cities, they're building stuff and moving the black folks out, okay? And rebuilding it for especially a lot of apartments, condos, and stuff for the well to do or affluent young whites. And so we have a reversal process going on. Ain't that something? But the key here, or one of the keys, is understanding this didn't happen by magic. None of it happened because of the um, none of it happened because of the failure of black people. See, that's what we've been led to believe, and that's what even a lot of white people like to say, is that, black people just tore up the neighborhoods and they're no good, and all of that's their fault. And they got poverty and all the shootings and poverty and all that stuff. That's their fault because they're black. And the truth is, these conditions were created and then nurtured to be what they are today. Ain't that something? Well, this is one of those, in other words, whites had it both ways. That's exactly right. That's exactly right, Clyde. White folks had it both ways. Tuh. All right. Now, this is one of these episodes that hopefully people will come back and watch it again and again until they get real good understanding of it. Because it's not, we need to understand, how do we get here? Because that's how we got here, right? And as you know, I like to say, no justice. Let's see. No justice. Can't spell today. Justice. No peace. No love. KNOW. And thank you for your patience. And I hope you got something out of this. And you can share it with somebody else. And thank you to Destiny. Thank you, Clyde. And I close with this.